Summer is over and school is back in session, and so is our show, Campus Killings. I'm Dr. Megan Sachs.
And I'm Dr. Amy Sloshberg, and we're the hosts of the podcast Campus Killings.
Season 3 of Campus Killings debuts September 14th, 2024, and this season will bring you 20 all-new cases.
Our show covers some of the most sinister crimes to take place on or around school campuses, or the cases we discuss have a school-connected theme.
In every episode, we break down exactly what happened, where things went wrong, and we provide our analysis as both educators and trained criminologists.
We hope that you'll join us for Season 3 of Campus Killings, and if you haven't listened to our first 2 seasons yet, there are plenty of episodes available for you to binge right now.
You're listening to The Murder in My Family, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including Missing Persons,
DNA ID,
Scene of the Crime,
Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective,
and Campus Killings.
all of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the podcast, its host, or sponsors. If you would like to discuss the murder in your family on this podcast, please be sure to visit themurderinmyfamily.com for more information. This episode may contain unsettling material or subject matter. Listener discretion is advised.
Independent podcasts like this one depend on word of mouth to bring in new listeners. So if you find that you enjoy this show, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to your podcasts. And be sure to introduce a friend to the show and invite them to listen. With your help, The Murder in My Family can continue to grow and reach a new audience. To learn more about the show or the cases we discuss, please visit themurderinmyfamily.com. You can also find us on Twitter with the handle @murderinmyfam or on Facebook at facebook.com/TMIMF podcast. If you'd like to support The Murder in My Family and get VIP access to things like ad-free listening, early preview episodes, and bonus content of not only this show, but every other podcast on the AbJack network of indie podcasts, consider subscribing to the show with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts for only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year. You'll unlock a variety of listener benefits, and you'll be supporting the show in the process. Your support is greatly appreciated, and thank you to all of our supporters that generously donate to help keep the show growing and improving. One last note, please support any of the sponsors that you hear on The Murder in My Family the way that those sponsors support this show. It's with our sponsor support that the show can go on and continue to provide a platform to share these stories with you in every episode. Thank you, and now, on to our show. Hey everybody, a little bit different of an episode for you today. We're going to be speaking with Madison McGhee, who is the host of the Ice Cold Case podcast. Madison has decided to investigate the murder of her father using this podcast, and let me tell you, it is an incredible show. She goes really deep into the case and looks at each aspect. So let's talk about this case a little bit before we get into my discussion with Madison. Madison's dad, John Cornelius, or J.C. McGhee, was shot and killed in his home in Bridgeport, Ohio, in the early morning hours of July 11th, 2002. It's important to know that J.C. lived right next door to his sister Pearl. Pearl lived with her son Omar. There are 2 911 calls that were made in the early morning hours of July 11th. One was about J.C. The other was about something that was happening at Pearl's house. According to Omar, Pearl's son, who made that call to 911, their house had been ransacked by burglars, and Pearl and Omar's girlfriend had been tied up, covered in a blanket, and threatened to be set on fire. There are a lot of inconsistencies in the reports from the people that were around when JC was murdered. And unfortunately, 22 years later, we find ourselves here with Madison trying to figure out what happened to her dad. Madison and I are not going to go into the full details of the case. There is just so many rabbit holes that you can run down. I really encourage you, if you want to hear the entire story, go listen to Ice Cold Case. Go listen to Madison's coverage of her dad's case. You're going to learn a lot. But we do talk about it. We talk about, what Madison needs and how we can help her. I really hope that you take this episode and that you're able to share the episode with others, talk about JC's case, and hopefully get some kind of answers or help to drive some more awareness so that Madison can find the answers that she and her family so desperately need. So with that, I'm not going to go on for much longer because I do really want you to go listen to the story that Madison and I talk about, but then go a little bit deeper and listen to her podcast, Ice Cold Case, which you can find a link to in the show notes below. Thank you so much for your support. Really appreciate it. Without further ado, let's get into the episode. Imagine you're walking through the park one day and you see a suspicious backpack sitting underneath a bench. You report it to the police, and upon investigating, they discover 2 live pipe bombs inside. You rush to clear the area before they explode, saving countless lives and preventing injury. Everyone declares you a hero for a fleeting moment, until everything changes and you are declared the prime suspect. This was the story of security guard Richard Jewell. After the Centennial Park bombing killed 1 person and wounded more than 200, public pressure and a media witch hunt pushed a desperate FBI to find a suspect. Despite obvious holes in the case, the FBI tried to get Jewell to confess by using unethical means. In the newest season of Generation Y, the Olympic Park bombing, hosts Aaron and Justin explore the aftermath of the 1996 Centennial Olympic Park bombing. Listen as they delve into the details of the case, the sway of public opinion, and the identity of the real killer who, after a years-long manhunt, was apprehended through pure luck and was found to be responsible for other bombings across the United States. Follow Generation Y, the Olympic Park bombing, on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to Generation Y early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus. Welcome to The Murder in My Family. Today I'm joined by a very special guest. Madison, if you don't mind introducing yourself to my listeners.
Yeah, I'm Madison McGhee. I am a producer, director, writer based in Los Angeles, California, and I guess most recently known as a podcast host, investigative journalist. 2 very new roles for me. But I have a podcast called Ice Cold Case where I'm investigating the murder of my dad, John Cornelius McGhee.
You and I have a similar path, I think, in the sense that we're both taking charge of our family's cases and trying to get some answers. And I am very excited to have you here. I've only listened to 10 episodes. I'm fully,
a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. I'm fully invested in this story. I'm fully invested in the case. I'm fully invested in you and your fight for justice right now, and I'm behind you 100%. So whatever you need from my end, whatever I can do to help, I'm happy to help you with. This is an episode that we're going to talk about JC. We're going to talk about your dad. And so, Madison, if you don't mind, can you just share a little bit about who JC was? Tell us his story.
Yeah. So my dad, J.C. McGhee, he went by J.C., was obviously a dad. He was a brother, an uncle, cousin. He had a massive family, several siblings, and they all have children who have children. And so it really is just like the biggest, blackest family in Ohio. And he was known as like a family guy. He had a lot of children with women, but really, I think I joke, he's like Nick Cannon light. I think he loved just like having children. And so he was super protective of them and the legacy I think that he saw in his children, and myself included. I did feel, even for the short amount of time that I knew him, this pride and joy feeling that I think he felt for the people who like share his DNA. And I think that expands beyond just children. I think he felt that with a lot of his family. I think he wanted everyone to be the best that they could be, given the context and the situations in which they were all growing up, which sort of leads into the other darker side of who my dad was. A bit of a victim of circumstance. He grew up in a really low income, racially profiled area. His only choices were really like have enough money to make something of yourself or deal drugs. And he obviously did the latter. And that led to a life and a lifestyle that I don't think he was ever comfortable with, but just felt like he had no choice and just played the cards he was dealt with. And it obviously didn't work out for him in the long run. But I do think that he has changed my life in a lot of ways, even since his death. Me and my understanding and empathy of these communities, these struggles that I never really had to deal with because I was so protected from them. And obviously now a lot of my career is surrounded by this thing that happened, and my ability to solve this case is still TBD, but I have found this really interesting niche in like helping other people, which has been really special. And I think something that my dad would be really proud of. He was really generous and always looking out for other people. And I think that we shared a lot of that. He was also really mentally ill and anxious, and those things. So I think that I inherited a lot of things from my dad that maybe I didn't realize until I started looking into his life and who he was and started to see those things.
So I know, and don't feel like you have to go super deep into this, but I know that there's some unique things about your family and about your situation and about your dad. So a listener who may not know your story may not understand why you're like, oh, I just found all this out about my dad. Can you talk a little bit about some of that complication in the story? Because it does get a little confusing, right? As you're like laying it all out. Yeah.
It's wild. Super non-traditional. I grew up with my mom in West Virginia, about 2.5 hours away from where my dad lived. So I saw my dad. I definitely didn't have the type of relationship where it was like my dad ran out and I don't know who he is or whatever. I very much had my dad in my life and anticipate that if he was still alive, we would still be very much in contact. And I just didn't know my dad's side of the family very well. And I also didn't really know, like, my perspective. My dad died when I was 6. My perspective of my dad was like, he's the best guy in the world. And so you don't really know or are exposed to these like darker things about your parents, even if it's like on a lesser scale of like, my mom drank in college or whatever. You don't learn that stuff about your parents. And I didn't know that my dad was dealing drugs and doing all this stuff until I started looking into his life 20 years post his death, because you just don't know those kinds of things. And I wasn't around my dad's side of the family. So there weren't any even rumors to hear down the hallway or rumblings or secrets or whispers. So I really was, my dad's the best guy ever. And that's that. So yeah, interesting.
That is interesting. And my brother I was 6 when my brother died. So definitely understand like your perspective of things is very different as a 6-year-old than it is as an adult. That makes perfect sense when you put it that way. Now I'm with you here. Great. So let's talk a little bit about the circumstances that led up to JC's death. And then we can go into what you know has happened or what you found out has happened as you started investigating this case, if you don't mind.
Yeah. The day of the death is honestly, in a lot of weird, contradictory ways, super straightforward and also very confusing. My dad lived next door to his sister, a son, and they lived in this house just next door to my dad. And someone broke into my dad's sister's house in the middle of the morning. It was like 6 a.m. They broke in. There were 3 or 4 of them. They ransacked the house. They flipped it upside down, basically. They were in there for about 35 minutes. They go outside. They take Omar, my cousin, my dad's nephew, outside with them. They end up at my dad's house. They kick in the door. My dad is standing there. He's shot, 1 shot. He falls. He's dead. Then they leave. And on paper, it seems pretty like this happened, then this happened. And then you get into sort of the nitty gritty of it, and none of it makes any sense. Who are these people? Why were they there? What were they doing for 35 minutes? Why did they take Omar outside? Why would they go to my dad's house? Why, if they were trying to rob these people, would they just kill my dad and not steal anything? There's just so many other weird things going on. And then excluding, when you look at anyone's life, which this is something I learned when I was investigating my dad's murder, there's motive to kill literally anyone. If you died today, I could look at your life and be like, well, the other day he cut someone off driving and they really hated him. And, oh, he got in a fight with a coworker 2
Right.
weeks ago or whatever. There's always motive. So then you look at this like very big question mark morning, and then you look at my dad's life and you're like, now there's all these different people who could have wanted him dead. And then it just becomes this big mess. And that's where I picked up the pieces 20 years after it happened, which also adds in this element of good luck. Now it's been so long. And I think that's where this story honestly begins. The story begins in the end because I pick it up at such an interesting point. And then the whole story is essentially a flashback of this is what was going on. I just wasn't there and I didn't know. So
People who are potential witnesses. And I think it's really a fascinating approach to investigating this case. Was it difficult for you to remove your emotions from the whole situation? Like, how successful were you at that? Because I am not successful at that.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I guess it's like up to the listener, right? And reviews are mixed. There are people who are like, wow, it's incredible how easily you were able to just tell this story and make us feel like we were part of it and you were an investigative journalist. Other people are like, oh my God, my dad, it's all about whatever. And it's so emotional and biased, and that's fine. But I think from my own perspective, I think I try to ride that line knowing I will cross it several times an episode. I cross it every day. Very difficult for me to separate my emotions from literally anything. I'm working on a food television show right now, and I get so invested in like these chefs and their restaurants and their families. And it's like they lose and I cry. I'm bad at that in general. So then to have a project that's so deeply personal, I'm not even going to try to completely shut it off because I know that I won't be able to, but I can try to do it in like the most tasteful way, the most responsible way, the most professional way. And when it is happening, acknowledge that it's happening and then try to find the other side as much as possible. And so that's what I do as best as I can, but it's so hard to, remove yourself from it, especially when in my opinion, the difference between me telling this story and me passing it off to a crime junkie or an up and vanished or a whatever is the fact that it's personal to me.
Yeah.
So if I remove it entirely, I could be anyone telling this story and it wouldn't really matter. So I don't know. It's weird. It's a weird balance.
It's interesting because I am definitely not saying that you should remove your emotions from. I think that there's value in making that story compelling because it's coming from a place of loss and a place of heartbreak and a place of frustration and anger. And all of those feelings are valid. But I do think that there is an expectation from the average true crime consumer that I don't want to have to feel what these people are going through because then it makes it real. I think that there is a level of that. So
it reminds them that this content they're consuming that they find entertaining is actually real people's lives. And I think there's space for this in the marketplace now. I think my show is potentially a pioneer of this new movement. I hope that people can take charge of their own stories and that we're carving out audience for people who want that. And it can shift the tone of the way people listen to these stories. But there is a lot of people, that I meet at conferences and I meet all over the world that are just in it for this juicy story. And that's fine.
it's fine.
But then maybe my show is not for you.
Right.
So yeah, it is interesting. And I think that I talk about this a lot because I actually work in the industry. So there's this weird recycle wheel that I stare at all the time, which is there's demand, which creates supply, but the supply actually dictates the demand. And you're consuming content and you think that you have a say in what these networks make because you decide what you like and what you don't like. But you're only deciding that based on what you're given.
Right.
So you only have limited options anyways. So I think the more people are fed personal stories told by victims' families, the palette will shift to like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so new and so different that it's hard for people when my show launched to be like, whoa, you're telling your own. I'm not hearing this from a big name in true crime. I'm hearing this from like the person who's like the most connected to this story. That's weird. But I think over time, as more people create that, there will become a taste for it. And then more people will make more of that. And then it all, that
balances
wheel
out.
keeps going.
Yeah. I love it. And I love being a part of this kind of shift in the conversation and being a family member who did start creating true crime. And like you, I did enjoy watching, consuming, listening to these stories, even though I had my own history. It was a bit of a couple of things, I think, escapism, but also just trying to learn as much as I can about the way these investigations go and just trying to understand the process from that perspective. And then also just being like an adrenaline junkie in general, as somebody who struggles with a lot of anxiety and PTSD and all that other stuff. Sometimes I need to check out and go into somebody else's problems for a minute and get out of mine. But one of the things you talk about the fallacy of a perfect victim. It's something that is super important to me as I help families tell these stories, to highlight the fact that there is no such thing. Everybody has their own struggles. Everybody has their own challenges, their own history, their own trauma, and their way of dealing with those things. And I feel like there's a lot of room to hold that space and say, look, every person deserves justice in the situation. Every person deserves to be found, whether you agree with their life or not. It doesn't devalue the importance of justice, like for your family and for my family. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I know I blabbed about it a long time, but can you add to that?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things to talk about, honestly, because I think about it constantly. I always put myself in the boat of my dad. And I think to myself, if that were me, what would people say about me? And would they justify my dad? And what would they say? And who would come out of the woodwork? And people, I think, have always had this question of, what would people say at your funeral and whatever? And to think, okay, but what if you were missing or murdered? That shifts the conversation, right? And we see it on the news all the time. If it's a young, beautiful woman, there's nothing bad to be said. It doesn't matter if she bullied someone in high school or created someone's worst day ever. She's this perfect person who did not deserve to die. And my dad, on the other hand, is only characterized by the bad things he did. And there's lots of reasons for that outside of gender, race, etc., social status, economic status, etc. But think about, I am the villain in someone's story, for sure. Someone does not like me. Probably a lot of people. And thinking about if those were the only people that were allowed to talk if I went missing is crazy, because we're all dynamic. We all have good things about us. We all have bad things about us. And not one or the other should characterize us when our lives or our reputations or our legacy is on the line. And I think that's where this sort of comes in, is I wonder what would have happened with my dad's investigation if he was characterized as a loving father who was trying so desperately hard to take care of his children versus a confidential informant who used to be a drug dealer who lived in this rundown home in Ohio. And when you think about that, it really makes you wonder, like, how many cases would be solved, because public opinion and public interest drives these investigations, which is insane and crazy and a whole separate issue, right? Like, these, police departments are funded by the locals who pay their taxes, and it shouldn't matter if, like, Good Morning America in New York City is talking about a case. However, that's the way it goes. But they're never going, I mean, it's still, I've pitched, they're never going to talk about my dad. They're going to talk about, the college kids who get murdered in a house because they were just trying to better their lives by going to school. And how terrible is that? And like, my dad dropped out of middle school, right? There's just this idea that, oh, you have to be perfect for your life to matter and for your death to feel unjustified and all of these weird things. And I'm on a warpath, just shatter that, because I don't believe anyone deserves to die. It doesn't matter. I feel that way about death penalty. I feel that way about all of the things. In any sense, there's no argument you could make to me where I'm like, oh yeah, they probably shouldn't have died. I don't believe that. And I think that it's really tough to be on the other side of someone I loved and cared for, and them being alive could have completely changed my life, to say, oh, it didn't matter. Like he just deserved it. Even sometimes now that the show has gotten a little more popular, I get lots of reviews, which is super fun. And some of them are like, oh, heard he was a drug dealer. No wonder this happened. You know what I mean? And it's that idea of like perfect victim is so crazy, because you could find the most John Benet Ramsey, right? Who could she have hurt? She was like a kid. She was probably mean to another kid. She probably stole a crayon or something like that. Nobody's perfect. And it's crazy to assume that death should matter more than someone else's because of these sort of, I don't know, qualifiers that are completely made up. I'm ranting now, but that's the idea that I'm trying to fight very hard, and why my show exists in the way that it does. I didn't really want to be the center focus of the show, but it was the only way to get listeners to be like, oh shit, that's her dad. And I think if you can see it from that perspective, all the other things my dad did don't really matter anymore. And now you feel bad that my dad was murdered. And I think that is how I draw you in to be like, exactly, the point.
Yeah. And I love that you did show all those sides of your dad and the situation, because I think it really, without that information, you really don't understand the full story. And not to say that I do yet, because I'm only on episode 10. And I'm sure that more is going to continue to develop as you continue to ask questions. And I'm sure there's a lot that you probably haven't even talked about yet that you may or may not. But I do love how you bring all of this up and you bring it out in the open and you say, this is exactly what was happening. And here's what's happening with my cousin and all of those things. So can you talk a little bit, because I feel like we veered away from the story, I want to come back to the story, about has how you feel about the case changed dramatically as you've begun to like look at this deeper? Because I know there's a lot of people, right? You've got Daryl, you've got some guy potentially named Tone, you got Butch, you've got all of these players that are involved, and like you said, have maybe in their mind some reasons why they would have wanted to hurt your dad. Can you talk a little bit about some of these suspects and where they are in the scenario and what happened?
Yeah. Let's start with Butchie Griffith. It's a really interesting character because on paper, he killed my dad, right? Like he had so many different motives. He had an affair with my dad's wife, Barb, who's my sister's mom. They were actually married. My parents were never married. But my dad was actually married to Barb, and Barb had an affair with this guy, Butchie. And so there's already this beef. They didn't get along. Fighting over the same women seemed to be a common theme with them. My dad was an informant and actually got Butchie some time behind bars for a little while. And so the motive is just like growing and growing for Butchie. And then my dad got a woman, Deneen, pregnant, who was also seeing Butchie. And I think there was just this sort of resentment there. And Deneen ended up having the kid, which added this other element of now they share this child and Butchie's still around. And my dad has this kid with Deneen. And it's all of this weird stuff. He was like the easiest person to assume killed my dad. And I still am like, even though I'm pretty off of him, I'm not someone who's, it couldn't have been. I'm like, it could have been. But I'm finding more with other people. So it's seeming less likely. But until I can rule it out, I'm like, it's not ruled out for me. So he's definitely someone that I haven't spoken to about this. I almost accidentally spoke to him, which is weird. I was talking to my brother on the phone several years ago, like via video chat, whatever. And he actually is still very close with Butchie. And I had asked him, I was like, where are you? And he's, I'm at Butchie's house. And he hands the phone to Butchie. So now I'm looking at Butchie and I'm like, hi, how are you? I'm JC's daughter, Madison. And he's, I've never heard of you before. I didn't know about you. I was like, oh, what's that? And then Shane took the phone back. But very interesting. So I know where he lives and we haven't talked since. I haven't been able to directly get in touch with him. I'm also not opposed to showing up at people's houses. So see what happens with that. But yeah, he's definitely like on I wouldn't say he's on my short list anymore, but he's definitely on a list. People that I definitely want to talk to. Even to add context, if it wasn't him, he was around at the time. He did have this grudge against my dad. He's in all of the police files. They interviewed him extensively. I think he did a polygraph test. Like they were talking to him at one point and dismissed him as a suspect. But he's one person that I heavily suspected in the beginning. And there's this long story about a custody battle that you'll have to listen to in the show, but very crazy stories. Moving on to Daryl Smith, his sort of cronies, I call them. There's been some developments in the last week with Daryl. So it's an interesting point when I talk about him because it's very hard for me to mask how I feel now versus put myself in the position of like where you're listening right now. He was my number one suspect from the beginning. I remember the day that I got the police files, I Googled him because his name is all over the files. And as much as I dog on the police, I think the one thing they got right in the beginning was that Daryl Smith killed my dad. So I was like, okay, like maybe they're onto something here. Maybe they tried, whatever. And so I'm Googling Daryl Smith at the time. This was several years ago, like 5 years ago, 6 years ago. He had been arrested for attempted murder, assault, and battery on this woman that he brutally beat the crap out of. And ended up, something weird happened. He spent a little bit of time and then got out of it. I don't know. It's all very weird in this town. But at the time, that was what he was dealing with. So I remember reading about my dad, reading this about Daryl and going, oh, the connection is so strong. Obviously, he's capable of this. And from the beginning, I just had this weird feeling that like Daryl Smith was the guy. And so I spent a lot of my time really believing that and looking at this from that perspective. And put out the show with him sort of at the crux of this story. There were other people there. Whether or not Daryl was the one who pulled the trigger, I was unsure. There were probably 4 people there. It could have been any of them. Who were these other guys? I'm trying to figure that out. But I knew that Daryl Smith's name was buzzing around and people I talked to always talked about him and he was the guy, right? Then the show got really popular and I am a sucker from anyone who will give it to me. So when people started to say that I was super biased and I just threw this on Daryl and how could it be him? Look at this custody battle. A custody battle is like the obvious path. Duh, it was this. What Daryl? That's so random. I decided that my goal for part 2, which is what you've just started listening to in episode 10, was to prove myself wrong. Because you have to do that in court anyways, right? It's like you're innocent until proven guilty. So it's actually this weird reverse where like when you're prepping a trial, I'm not a lawyer, but I did win my mock trial in high school. You have to do the reverse. You can't just try to prove that you're right. You actually have to be like, and this is why I can't be wrong. I've tried all these ways to prove myself wrong and it all leads back still to this person. So I was like, okay, fine. I'm hearing you. I'm seeing these comments. I'm reading all this stuff. How about I try to prove it wasn't Daryl? And if I can't, then it was. How about that? And that was the idea for part 2 that I started forming right around literally, I think actually 3 days ago was the release of episode 9. I released the final episode and then the next day probably I was like, all right. And now we're working on this sort of new phase of this, which is like, how can I prove Daryl's innocence? What can I do to say that it wasn't him? And Daryl didn't know this, obviously. At the time of the release of the show, Daryl was in prison. So I didn't know if they were passing out iPhones in prison to listen to Apple podcasts, but I didn't think he was really aware of this. But I knew he was in prison, and I had looked up his inmate number and what prison he was in. And it's very complicated. In certain parts of the country, it's always different. But here you have to get added to a visitor list in order to visit them or even do like a phone call, whatever. But he didn't know who I was in my mind. I didn't know he knew who I was. So I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have to write this man a letter and be like, hello, I accuse you of killing my dad in a podcast, and I'd really love to talk to you. Can you add me to your visitor list? I write this letter in about 18 different variations. I never sent a single one. Finally, this took me from September. It was December 12th that I was like, okay, I'm going to mail this letter. And on December 13th, I woke up to a message on Facebook, and it was from Daryl Smith. And it's funny because it was long and I was freaking out because I knew it was him. It didn't have his name. It was a photo of him and another name associated with him. So I had a feeling it was him. But I was also like, this could be like freak. I don't know. But I read it and I was like, I think this is him. He was really kind and a little funny, a little all over the place. He starts it like, hope you're doing well. In the middle, I'm suing you. I can't believe you talked about me in the podcast. Then he ends it with happy holiday. So it was just this funny like roller coaster of a message. And it took me a couple days to respond because I was like, I don't even know what to say. I think I called my lawyer. Like I was just like freaking out.
Yeah.
And but it was like what I wanted, right? I was like, I was about to write you a letter, but also, why are you not in prison? What's happening here? A lot of things going through my mind. A couple days later, I get a message from someone who's been helping me, sending me little clips of newspaper clippings and things as things come up that are around this town, an anonymous source, if you will. And they messaged me saying, I heard Daryl Smith is out of prison. And I was like, oh, crazy. I obviously knew. And that's when Daryl was like, I'd love to talk to you and tell you why I didn't kill your dad. And I was like, perfect, because that's what this whole next thing is about to be. A month later, I fly out to Virginia and we meet up at the Ohio County Public Library. And I sit face to face with Daryl Smith. And I'll tell you what, back in the moment I left and I was like, no way that guy killed my dad. There's no way. For lots of reasons. Mainly, it seems very serial killer to meet with the daughter of the victim. It doesn't feel like gang-related violence activity to sit with the daughter of a victim. It just doesn't feel organic to like that culture. And so I was like, why would this man reach out to me, sit across from me if he shot my dad? But he was super charismatic, super charming. I do believe at the end of the conversation, we hugged and he left. Very crazy. But I was very convinced that I needed to explore other paths after we talked. And we stayed in touch for a bit. He would reach out every now and then. I did send him, hey, the episode is dropping and this is what I'm putting in. And is this okay? Just making sure. He said some things that even related to my dad, but just to add context to the world that I wanted to make sure he wasn't going to get some slack for. So it's just like verifying those types of things. And he was super receptive and the episodes came out and everything seemed fine. I started to get more info, to talk to more people. I started to hear from people in places that I never thought I would hear from people in my life. I got really skeptical that maybe I had been duped and that this was all this weird sort of narcissistic feel-good moment for him of, okay, at least she thinks I'm a good guy. And that's all that matters. And I can move on with my life and she can move on with her life and whatever. And then recently, Daryl Smith was arrested again. And he has this sort of thing where he blames the police for targeting him. And that was the crux of our conversation was, oh, the police are just throwing this on me because they like to throw things at me that I didn't do. And he was arrested over the summer. When I stopped hearing from him, I was like, something is off. And then I found out he had been arrested for a really big drug trafficking scheme. And I assumed he was going to be like, oh my God, it wasn't me. Look at them doing this again. They're framing me, blah, blah, blah. A few days ago, a week ago, maybe now, he actually admitted to the charges and pleaded guilty. And I think it all shifted for me in that moment where I was like, he can't say they framed him, so he has to take a plea deal, which means he did it, which means he could have done other things, which means he wanted me to help him by saying he didn't kill my dad. They're framing him so that he could use that in other future cases to say, look at their history of framing me for other things. And I think he potentially knew that this case was coming up. The timing of us meeting is very strange. And I think he was, in his own mind, almost building his own case and using me as a pawn in his bigger game of saying, look at all the things Belmont County has done against me. So now I'm in a weird place. I think I sat 3 feet from the person who killed my dad, now in prison for something else. I now know the names of people I didn't know the names of before. Or are they? Will they talk? Now that Daryl's potentially ratting out other people to maybe get a lesser sentence, is there room for people to rat out him? What's happening? What do I do? And that all sets the tone. Here I am back in September 8th of another year going, and now I'm prepping for the next 9 episodes. And I don't know where I'm going from here. And I don't know what I'm doing. And I can't believe I was in that same boat a year ago exactly. But it feels like I'm getting to a point where this might be the end of the show. And I have 9 more left in me. And I think I might be done because it's all starting to fall together. Names of people are starting to come out. But yeah, Daryl is such a huge character in this story. Mm-hmm. And I just can't put my finger on it.
Was he the one who was named by Omar's girlfriend, or did she name somebody else? He was the one, right? Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that, for me, that gave so much credibility to, he was definitely there.
Definitely there.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm anxious to hear the rest of the season, and I'm anxious to hear the next 9 episodes that you produce. I think that you're doing a phenomenal job. I know that it's not easy to put yourself in this situation, but I also know that feeling of I have to. You know what I mean? Like that it just comes from being in this situation. And so I also love to hear that you're using this to like try to help other people too, because that's something I'm super passionate about. I don't know you, Madison, but I feel like I know you.
Been such an interesting journey because, I'm going to get emotional, but when I launched the show, oh my goodness, I did not expect this to be so emotional for me. But when I launched the show, it was me and 4 friends helped me do it for free because I didn't have any money. And we were really on an island, and we hit post. I didn't know how to upload a podcast. I didn't know how to make a podcast. I've only done film and TV, which is completely different. And I logged into Libsyn.com and hit publish. And it was like, what do we do now? Like, what happens now? And I remember that feeling. I remember that day very specifically, uploading that episode and just thinking like, that's it? How anticlimactic, not knowing the effect that one that seemed very insignificant at the time would have on my own life. But also I've met so many amazing people at CrimeCon and through Instagram and all of these places that come up to me. And it's such an honor because there's 150 podcasts and a lot of them much more famous than I am. And for them to come to me because they resonate with my story or they find some sort of similarity in it. And it's such an honor. I never expected in that moment on May 17th when I hit, I couldn't have imagined the people I would have met through doing this and the advocacy groups. I've met a lot of people that have the most insane stories that are looking for not even help, but just the same boat I was in where it was like, does anyone understand what this is or what this means and how to navigate this? And it's so lonely And so to be that person for someone, I've been through hell doing this. I wouldn't wish this part of it on anyone. Someone was asking me the other day if I could do this over again, what would I do differently? And I was like, I would have never done this. But now that I'm here, it's really empowering to be like, I get what you're going through. And it can feel a little less lonely because it is just so isolating to live with this sort of, I don't have closure feeling. And yeah, it's just been really incredible to meet people like you and just find this very weirdly specific niche of people who understand this very crazy thing. And it's just been incredible. But yeah, I think moving forward, like I want to get through what feels like closure for me and this show first.
Yeah.
And then start to explore what it means to help other people outside of helping myself, helping other people by inspiring them. But what tangible things can I do?
I just want to say, Madison, I think you are helping people right now, even though it doesn't feel like it. I think telling your story and taking control of your story and your dad's story is helping because it's inspiring me for sure. And I can guarantee you that there's other people that are going to hear this and they're going to hear your dad's story that are going to also be inspired. As we're winding down with this episode, is there anything that my listeners can do to help you in your fight for justice for JC? Is there anything that you need from the general public?
Yeah, it's funny. My method of getting this case solved was quite non-traditional. My method was get people to care, build up public interest, and just put as much pressure on the police department to do their job as possible. The biggest thing that I say is listen to the show, share it with people who you think would be interested, talk about my dad's case in the same way that you would talk about Gabby Petito or John Benet Ramsey or Casey Anthony or any of these other people that are big headline cases in true crime. And in the same way that we discussed, there's no such thing as a perfect victim. Give these other victims the same time and attention that you give the ones that are really over discussed. If you spend literally a moment of your time about my dad's case when you're doing your little wine and true crime chats with your friends, or you're in group chats about cases, or you're investigating things on Reddit, I think my dad's case might actually get solved. And it takes that added level of attention, I think, to get it across the finish line. I've done a lot of the legwork by making this case as interesting as possible. I've given you things to listen to. I put all the transcripts online if you prefer to read them. I am going to start uploading the case files whenever I have a moment. But in the same way, I remember 5 years ago, there was like this really interesting case, or this girl was missing out of Oregon, and I lived in Portland at the time. And I knew people who had literal group chats about it, someone they didn't know.
Yeah.
And it's, what about my dad? Why not me? Why not my dad's case? I think, yeah, if you just talk about it, share the show, it seems so silly, but like when shows hit number one, all of a sudden police departments are shaking in their boots. Oh my gosh, we have to do something about this. And because they won't answer my phone calls, that's the only method I have to get their attention. That's my goal right now, is just to get this to be as big as possible so that people all over the world are calling the Belmont County Sheriff's Department going, hey, I listened to this show and what are you doing about this? That's where I'm at right now. And if you have any information, obviously I will, that is really helpful, but I know that's a very small subsect of the United States. But if you're in Belmont County and you have any info, I'll take it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that people underestimate the value of a share or a mention of a case. It goes so far to just bring that awareness. And I agree with you. I think it does take that public pressure, because you got the prosecution office, which is typically an elected position for a district attorney or an attorney general. That public pressure goes so far to make them act, because unfortunately, it's been my discovery as I'm learning about the legal system, navigating it from this perspective. Prosecutors try cases in their heads all the time. And if they don't think they can win, they don't prosecute. It's not because they feel like a family needs justice. It's because they don't think they can win, because they are trying to stay elected. And that is an unfortunate reality of the legal system in America. There's a lot of good things about the legal system in America. There's a lot of bad things about the legal system in America. I definitely disagree with the idea of trying cases in your mind. I don't think that does anything for anybody. So I'm with you. I'm behind you. I'm hoping that my listeners are here with you and behind you. And we're going to put all of the necessary links in the show notes so that people can easily access your podcast as well as any social media that you want us to highlight.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my honor, Madison. I'm so excited to talk to you. I hope that I get to meet you in person one day, and I hope that I can see you at AdvocacyCon, because I think it's going to be really an amazing event.
Yes, I will be there. I'm really excited.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm very excited. I will definitely be there.
Awesome. Any parting thoughts as we wrap up, Madison? Anything else you want to share?
No, just to thank you so much for taking the time and talking with me. And thank you to your listeners for listening. And it's, like I said before, it's really, you can't ever anticipate what's going to happen when you share something or when you do something or start a project. And to be in this position now, like a year and some change after initially launching, it's these moments are such good reminders, even when things are feeling out of sorts or feeling really crazy or whatever, that there are people out there who are good. I deal with a lot of the bad people and talk to and about a lot of the bad people, and it can really mess with your head sometimes. And just thank you for what you're doing and for yourself also, but also for other people. I think it's just really incredible. And I'm honored to be in the mix with you and be on this path and this mission with you.
Likewise. All right, listener, you know what to do. Run over to Ice Cold Case, the podcast. It is super well done, super informative. Madison truly, unlike the police in this case, leaves no stone unturned and goes beyond what I think anybody would expect. So it's an amazing show. Go listen to it. Give her a 5-star review. Tell her she's doing a good job, because she is. All right. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you once again for joining me for this episode of The Murder in My Family. We'll be back here soon with an all-new episode of The Murder in My Family, and I hope that you'll join me for it. But before you go, remember that every murder victim means something to somebody.